down. I mean, they actually shut down. There was nothing happening. The exigent circumstances and the emergency orders were only for, I forget how they termed it or what they call it. I think it's a tier 1 case, which is, criminal cases, basically. They could only have arraignments for the first couple of months of the pandemic. So the backlog of the divorce courts, what I've actually seen, Eric, to be honest with you, is not necessarily an uptick or a downtick in the divorce rate. I've seen a huge uptick in the amount of cases that have been pushed off to mediation, because it is the court recognized the mechanics of how things were working and not working, because we couldn't get into the courthouse. We didn't have the access to the justice there physically. So they created forms and processes and procedures, and they put in place different things for people to get divorced on the papers, as we call it. So that had kind of always been there for a couple of years. We had introduction of what we would call a quickie divorce a couple of years ago, where you could waive the statutory NICI period, the cool down period before you get divorced. And we used that system during COVID to bring clients through the mediation process, whether it be through a Zoom app, a Skype app, or in person in your office, 6 feet apart with masks on. I actually did a whole lot of business in my parking lot during that time. Shoving papers through windows, things like that. But we took clients through the mediation process and we got them divorced rather quickly on the papers.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term, what does mediation mean, and how is that different from a regular divorce?
Mediation is not litigation. Let's put it that way. So you have two tracks a divorce can take, and a divorce, just so everybody knows, to bring it all the way back, is a divorce is actually a lawsuit. There's a plaintiff and a defendant. Somebody actually sues somebody for divorce, and you have a lawsuit. It's Smith versus Smith, right? Now in Connecticut, you can get divorced for any reason or no reason. We live in a no-fault divorce state. I don't have to prove that you cheated on my client. I don't have to prove that you broke down the relationship for my client to get a divorce. Anybody could walk into the courthouse, fill out the paperwork, and get divorced, okay? So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is when a client comes to me and says, I want a divorce, I do an intake process. And I'm not going to take you through the whole intake process. It takes about an hour to do it, but you get the point. It's an intake process. I get the basics, right? I get kind of the story of the case, and I get to determine whether or not this case would be ripe for litigation or mediation. And the way to tell, it's like a sniff test almost, is if the two parties can get along. Do they have some semblance of an agreement? Can they come and sit down at a table and open up to each other and talk to each other and talk things out with me? Can I negotiate or, have these folks negotiate with each other? Can I mediate this process for them? And if the answers to those questions are yes, 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 then maybe they can go through the mediation process successfully without court intervention. At that point, through a mediation, you can do everything from the beginning to the end without any court intervention until the absolute last second, when you put all the documents together in a nice little package, practically with a bow on top, and take it to the clerk's office and file it. And within 0 to 7 days, the clients are divorced on the papers. I just did one in February. Client called me on February 8th. They were divorced on February 28th. And they would have been divorced sooner, but there was like a little hiccup in between. So it was very quick. They had an agreement, basically. I worked out a few little things for them. I did all the paperwork, did it with the court, signed my mediation certificate, and they were divorced. I walked them into the courthouse at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. They were divorced by 9 o'clock the next morning.
Wow, that is quick.
Yes. So the other way that you can get divorced is litigation. And I'm not going to go into too much about that because we would be here until 2024. But litigation, as you can imagine, can get pretty dicey. And you don't want to get into that if you don't have to, right? It's cheaper, quicker, and easier to get a mediation. So if you can, don't fight with each other. Hire a mediator, get it all done, one flat fee, and you're divorced. Litigation can drag on for years. I have a couple of those going on right now.
So how did you come up with the name Tiger Tactics for the book?
I didn't come up with the name Tiger Tactics, Chip. I don't. Thank you. Somebody else came up with it. There was a couple of different options, I think, and maybe we all voted on it. It's a little fuzzy and vague because this all happened like right after I had that 5-year-old little boy that just walked in here and interrupted us. And there was a couple of names and a couple of, that like you have the title of the book and then you have that longer spiel, kind of what the book is about.
Yeah.
It ties it all in like 5 words. There was a couple of different versions of those, I think. And then somebody came up with the cover art, which is a tiger. And we all just loved the way that it looked and the way that it felt and the message that it was sending. Cause I guess we could have named it something about sharks maybe, but tiger seemed appropriate. And it's the alliteration of the T and the T, the Tiger Tactics. It all just worked out. And it's a cute little book and it's available on Amazon. And I have actually a few authors' copies that I could give away. So if you want to like do a giveaway or something and somebody wins the book, I can send them a copy and I can send each one of you a copy as well.
Fantastic. That would be great. So we'll have to figure out some sort of giveaway for that.
Yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, I do want to get a little personal.
Okay.
We have nothing to be frightened about. We have spoken on previous podcasts about the fact that you do have lupus.
Yes, I do.
That being a fairly major underlying condition, how did you cope with COVID?
Oh, so here's my COVID story. The last week of November and the first week of December 2019, I was so sick, I thought I was dying. I was so sick with something that no one could diagnose. Nobody knew what was wrong with me. I went to the walk-in 2 or 3 times. They told me I had an unidentified upper respiratory infection. They started throwing medicines at me and all kinds of stuff. It took about 2 weeks for it to course through my body and another 2 weeks to get over it. I was down for about a month, and about 2 or 3 months later, when the world locked down and we figured out COVID was COVID, it literally dawned on me I had COVID. And my hair started to fall out in March and April of 2020, which is actually a symptom of COVID-19, or a result of it. And then from March to, I don't know, maybe, when was it? The end of 2020, I just stayed in my house. I ran my entire practice through the phone, email, Zoom, Skype, Teams, and WebEx. I did everything here in the home office where I am today. And I would go into my office on off-peak hours at night on the weekends when my son could stay with my husband and I could go in and I wouldn't really see too many people. Sorry, somebody's calling. And then eventually my son started going back to daycare and I started going back to the office and I was fine. I got all my vaccines. I did everything I was supposed to. I wore a mask. I stayed away from people as much as I could. I required everyone that walked into the office to wear a mask. The people I shared the office space with all got COVID at some point. I totally avoided it at that point. And then my mother passed away. My mother passed away in December of 2021. And I went to see her every single day when she was in hospice for over a month. She was on a COVID floor. I never got COVID, okay? She passed away on December 28th. About a week later, on January 3rd, we had her funeral. About a week later, my husband got COVID, tested positive for COVID. And the next day I had to call the school and say to the nurse, I'm not sending my son in today because my husband has COVID. So I'm just going to presume that my son is going to test positive and then I'll eventually test positive. And she said to me, well, is there any way that you could isolate your son from your husband? And I laughed at her because 6 hours later in the middle of the night, my son, who's 5 years old, woke up out of his bed and came in our bed. We don't know, we're sleeping. He comes in our bed, lays down between us and is snuggling with us. Like I think it's a little too late to isolate the two of them. So eventually my son got COVID and then eventually I got COVID. And even though I was fully vaccinated and completely boosted, it was not a fun experience for me. And I can only tell you that I'm assuming it's because I have lupus. And no matter how many vaccines you have, and no matter how boosted you are, you still have immunocompromised stuff going on. And it's just not going to be an easy thing. So luckily, thank God, I didn't have to go to the hospital or anything like that. I took care of myself here at the house and everything eventually went away. But basically the entire month of January 2022, I was again stuck in the house suffering with COVID. And my husband had it, my son had it, he couldn't go to school. Every time he had a quarantine off my quarantine. He didn't go to school for 20 days. So I was in the house practicing again via Zoom, Skype, all those WebEx teams, and also teaching a kindergartner school because I had to do remote learning with him. And I was suffering from COVID. So it was very difficult. That was my COVID experience.
Yeah, the beginning of that actually sounds a lot like mine. Everybody in my house had been diagnosed. This was January 2020, so before we knew what it was. And at least the doctors were able to give you something. They just looked at us and went, yeah, you've got some unidentified virus. There's nothing we can do. Just let it go through. It's like, and it was, weeks later that we figured out what it was.
Yeah, no, I went back to the walk-in and I said, you sent me home last time saying it was a virus. There's nothing you could do for me. I'm not leaving here until you give me something. So they gave me what they must have given me, I think a Z-Pack or something like that. And they were telling me, to do it like an inhaler and all these things. And maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, maybe it was just time, but it was, it was horrible. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And I've had lots of clients that have, suffered from COVID, suffered with COVID with their family members, have been hospitalized, have been facing foreclosure and hospitalized for COVID. I've had a couple of elderly conserved clients die from COVID. I mean, it's affected so many people in so many ways that I don't think we'll ever really understand or know the overreaching consequences of it. And we're still not through it. I mean, everybody's like, oh yeah, mask choice and, it's warm out, go do this, go do that. I mean, we're still very careful. I still wear a mask in the office. I don't require the clients to wear a mask anymore. I leave it up to them as their choice, but I feel like it's customer service. It's a tiger tactic to wear my mask and not only protect myself, but also protect the vulnerable people that are